Hello, I'm Bob Trebshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about Anglo-Saxon Leicestershire. Not so much about any nitty-gritty details, but more about why Leicestershire has more evidence for Anglo-Saxon activities than almost any other English county. Now, I moved back to Leicestershire in 1986. At that time, the available information on Anglo-Saxon Leicestershire was, shall we say, minimal. But in the following 40 years, this has changed almost out of recognition. In part, this is because of archaeological discoveries, significant contributions by both amateurs as well as professionals. At least as important, Leicestershire and Rutland now have county-wide publications on major and minor place names. And so far this is unique for an English county. Other counties only have studies of the major place names and, well, shall we say, patchy publications on specific hundreds. And in addition to that, there's been some useful academic papers on aspects of the, well, better documented history. One of those papers offers especially rewarding insights. Now, there's scope for someone to join up all the different strands of information, but I'm not going to make any attempt to do so in this video. I simply want to draw attention to the key sources. Most of what we knew back in the 1970s and into the 1980s was almost entirely about how dead Anglo-Saxons were buried, either as inhumations or as cremations. Settlement sites were, well, almost unknown. However, starting in the late 70s, Peter Liddell's community archaeology fieldwalking projects throughout Leicestershire started to shed considerable light on, well, the pre-nucleation dispersed farmsteads, especially in the Medbourne area and around the Langtons, which are walked by Paul Bowman. Not all of Leicestershire has been fieldwalked, and usually only in a more partial way, but, seemingly, there was a farmstead spaced about every kilometre, depending on the availability of a reliable water supply. Such farmsteads, and their spacing, is a continuation of Romano-British settlement patterns, although farmsteads in the more marginal hilltop locations tended to be abandoned around the 5th and 6th centuries, as the local population, shall we say, adapted to the departure of the Roman army. From the 7th century, there was extensive migration into Leicestershire and Rutland from the continent, the Angles and the Saxons, and also the Jutes and Frisians. By the 9th century, Leicestershire, although significantly not Rutland, was settled by Scandinavians. In common with other parts of England, the introduction of the Portable Antiquities Scheme in 1997 opened the floodgates for the proper recording of metal detectorist finds. The online PAS database is itself a treasure trove of information. Leicestershire was lucky in having Wendy Scott as the PAS Finds Liaison Officer from, well, 1997 when it started, until 2020. This role is now fulfilled by Megan Gard, because Wendy went off to do a PhD, having become especially interested in 5th century Scandinavian amulets, known as bracteates. Wendy has published papers on two identical ones, found close by in Leicestershire. Wendy and Jill Bourne combined their knowledge of materials, culture and place names to suggest that Melton Mowbray was a regionally important Anglo-Saxon central place. Also since the mid-1990s, developer-funded excavations have revealed both minor and major settlement sites for most centuries during the Anglo-Saxon era. Sadly, the funding of major excavations rarely covers the substantial costs of post-excavation analysis and full publication. So the full story of two substantial Anglo-Saxon settlements to the west of Melton Mowbray has yet to be established. There is another aspect of the material culture in Anglo-Saxon Leicestershire which less often ends up in museums. I'm referring to the substantial number of Anglo-Saxon stone carvings. Most of these are fragments of cross shafts and grave covers, often incorporated into the fabric of churches, as with these examples at Market Overton and Harston. But two near-complete cross fragments stand in the churchyards at Rothley and Sproston. The Rothley one is missing the wheel cross originally on the top, and the Sproston one is missing the lower part. There are other cross shafts, like these at Astridby and Foxton, which now stand inside the parish churches. Leicestershire is also home to one of the most important surviving collections of 8th century carvings. The remarkable frieze is now inside Breedon Church, but originally on the outside of a much older building. About 200 years later, these apostles and an archangel, most likely Archangel Gabriel, were carved. At Breedon is also a collection of cross-shaft fragments which incorporate both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian motifs. The long-running corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture project at Durham University is close to completing the volume on Leicestershire. This will be a useful resource, as the volume for Wiltshire proved to be while I was living in that county. One of the novel insights will be knowing with some certainty where the stone was quarried, as this will indicate trade routes and maybe secular and ecclesiastical patronage. In the meantime, the iconography on these carvings can be studied. Although the Leicestershire examples need to be put into a regional and even national context, they do allow insights into slowly evolving worldviews. In the description below, I've included links to free PDFs I've published about continuity of iconography on Anglo-Saxon sculpture. Now, exciting and informative as all the archaeological discoveries and material culture are, our understanding of Anglo-Saxon Leicestershire has also benefited from two important non-archaeological studies. The most exceptional is Barry Cox's lifetime of work studying the place names of Leicestershire and Rutland. Not just the major settlement names, but all the minor names, such as field names and pub names. Few, if any, counties have such a complete resource. Even before Barry Cox's work was published, Jill Bourne had shown that the Scandinavian settlement in Leicestershire, especially in Framland, but almost none in Rutland, is preserved in the place name evidence. Rebecca Gregory, based at Nottingham University, continues to research the Vikings in the East Midlands, using place names as a key part of her approach. Place names offer both simple and sophisticated insights. Among the simplest are, the Waltons and the Burtons. Walton is from Waltun, which means the settlement of the British-speaking slaves, so clearly from the early phases of Anglo-Saxon settlement, and suggesting something a bit akin to apartheid-era South African townships and the associated segregation. Burtons are several centuries later, during the reign of King Alfred, most probably the 870s, and were deliberately planted garrison settlements to help defend against Viking raids. The three Burtons in Leicestershire, Burton Overy, Burton Lazarus and Burton on the Wolds, were strategically sited to protect the Royal Estate Centre at Great Glen, the important central place at or near Melton Mowbray, and the crossing of the River Soar between Coates and Loughborough, which would have been of strategic military significance when defending against waterborne raiders attempting to come up the Soar and thence to the Reek and Melton Mowbray. Other place name elements require more sophisticated approaches. Graham Aldred produced a PhD on worth names in Leicestershire and Mercia, attempting to understand why worths tend to cluster in groups of 3 or 4 close to junctions of major routes, usually of Roman origin. A considerable amount of my own research into the Anglo-Saxons of Leicestershire also stands on the shoulders of Barry Cox's place name publications. For example, my earlier video on Anglo-Saxon boundary shrine is based on the distribution of the place name element Ho, as in the various Leicestershire villages of Houghton, Hoby and Hose. Or shall we say, thanks to Viking depredations, Leicestershire has few Anglo-Saxon charters or contemporary historical sources, which makes historical research rather tricky. For the period before the Norman Conquest, even Michael Wood's work at Kibworth for the 2010 TV series Story of England relied on using archaeology and landscape and language and DNA analysis. But the near absence of documentary evidence is not a total barrier. Using a mix of surviving records and minor place names, Susan Kilby has made some remarkable insights into the lifestyles of ordinary people, the peasants if you like. As yet she has not looked at Leicestershire or Rutland. A concise but most valuable study by David Parsons, published back in 1996, identified the earliest churches, more correctly known as minsters, in Leicestershire and Rutland. This required careful analysis of later documents. Only a few other counties, such as Wiltshire, Radnorshire, part of Sussex, and the Thames Valley, have received comparable investigations. But in the Midlands, so far as I'm aware, David's study is unique. In the description below I'll include details of David's paper and also my free PDF on minsters and valleys, which draws upon his work and puts it into a wider context. By identifying the early churches, we have also identified the first places which could be described as nucleated settlements, although the 6th and 7th century minsters differ from 10th and 11th century nucleation. A key difference is that minsters are all situated to allow waterborne trade. I've already uploaded a video about early churches of waterborne trade, so no need to go into details at the moment. Suffice to say that the whole enterprise of erecting homes and churches to create a minster, not to mention acquiring the latest in agricultural technology, required a substantial investment by relevant landholders. The church is not there simply out of piety. It brought the big added bonus of a literate priest, a cleric, a clerk. I mean, the two words are cognate to the estate. This enabled correspondence to and from the king and other minsters. Some, though not all, these early churches evolved into later market towns, and the ones which didn't, such as Luffenham, didn't do so because of, radical Norman interventions, in that case building a castle at Oakham. Interestingly, these 6th, 7th century minsters also allow a glimpse backwards in time as well, as many seem to inherit the lands of former Roman estates, which themselves are most likely to be Iron Age or just maybe Late Bronze Age in origin. David Parsons' paper was prepared for an innovative conference in 1991, which took a broad view of Anglo-Saxon landscapes in the East Midlands. The conference was instigated and organised by Jill Bourne, who brought together archaeological approaches with art historians and, others, including Ian Wilkinson, who looked in detail at the geology underlying Anglo-Saxon settlements, revealing that the earliest settlements were on the best drained soils, such as sands and gravels. So far as I'm aware, the scope of Jill's pioneering conference has not been emulated over 30 years later. From the 6th to the 11th centuries, agriculture steadily evolved, in part to deal with climate changes. Despite the repeated crop failures and cattle pestilence recorded in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, the population grew quite rapidly. In the late 9th century, Leicestershire became part of the Danelaw, so the concept of buying and selling land arose, something novel in Britain at the time, and not adopted in Wessex anything like so quickly. Landowners began to think of longer-term investments in their lands, notably investing in mouldboard ploughs and the 8 oxen and all the tack that went with. And this investment in equipment was one of the key reasons why the population was able to grow fairly rapidly. In a future video I'll discuss how the 2 and 3 great field systems and the associated nucleated villages took over most of the Midlands in the 10th and 11th centuries. We have a realistic snapshot of mid-11th century Leicestershire from the Domesday Survey of 1086. This tells us that Leicestershire's population was quite substantial for the time, only matched by other rich agrarian districts such as Lincolnshire. But the main surviving evidence for later Anglo-Saxon Leicestershire is so abundant that we're wont to ignore it. Most of the settlements which evolved into nucleated villages during the 10th and 11th century still exist as modern-day villages, which in turn means that most of our roads and lanes came into existence about the same time. Looking at things from a bigger perspective, it was during the mid-Saxon period that Christianity became the national religion. Our languages evolved into something distinctively English during the later Anglo-Saxon era, while the laws and judicial practices which still form the basis of our governance began to be formulated. Leicestershire conforms to all these overall changes. So, by combining fairly well understood national trends with the exceptionally good archaeological, iconographical and toponymical resources for the county, the stage is set for unique insights, especially ones which look across the boundaries of the different disciplines and combine, for example, material culture with geology, topography and the place name studies, just as Jill Bourne pioneered back in 1991, but now with the benefit of vastly more research.